Number 10. Ganching. The hooks of the Barbary Coast. The Regency of Algiers in the 16th and 17th centuries was not, strictly speaking, a pirate haven, the way Nassau or Port Royal were pirate havens. It was something older and more organized, a state that had grown wealthy on Corso, the maritime raiding conducted under Ottoman license against Christian shipping. Tens of thousands of Europeans, sometimes as many as 25,000 at a time by contemporary estimates, lived inside the walls of the city as slaves. They rode the Corsair galleys. They worked the quarries. They served in the households of the janissaries. And when they tried to escape, or when they rose against their masters, they encountered a punishment so calculated in its symbolism that it lived in European nightmares for 3 centuries afterward. It was called ganching, and it was as simple as it was terrible. Iron hooks were driven into the outer face of the city walls near the gates in view of every foreigner arriving by land or sea. A condemned slave was taken to the top of the wall, stripped, bound, and thrown. Where the hook caught him depended on how he fell. Sometimes it went through a thigh, sometimes through the small of the back. Sometimes, if the drop and the twist were right, it went through the chest and killed him within an hour. And that was considered a merciful outcome. More often, the hook caught meat that would not kill him, and there he hung. In view of the harbor and the caravan road for the length of time it took his body to lose blood or retention, this was not a private punishment. The whole architecture of it was public. The Icelandic captives, taken in the 1627 Turkish raid, the ones written about by Pastor Ólafur Egilsson after his own captivity and eventual return, described watching men hang on those hooks for 2 and 3 days while the sun rose and set, and rose again. Ganching was not designed to kill efficiently. It was designed to be arithmetic. A slave contemplating an attempted escape could stand in the shadow of that wall and count the hours another man had already been dying, and he could make his calculation. A merchant walking through the harbor could see, without being told what happened to men in the city who tested the terms of their captivity. It was information in the coldest possible form. In the surviving accounts of European captives, ransomed home, the ganches of Algiers are described more often than the auction blocks. Even men who had been chained to an oar for a decade, men who had felt the whip laid across their backs 1,000 times, remembered the hooks as the thing that had frightened them into obedience. Not the whip and not the chain, but the promise that the last hours of their lives could be turned into a public timetable for someone else's benefit. That is what ganching was. It was time made visible, and it worked, in the sense that the ledger of successful escapes from Algiers across 300 years remained a very thin ledger, and every man in the city knew exactly why. Number 9. Turning King's evidence. Now we move from the physical to the psychological, because the next punishment on this list left no marks on the body at all. It left them on the name. In the trials that broke the back of the golden age of piracy, the trials at Charleston and Boston and Kingston, and the Old Bailey between 1717 and 1725, the Crown had a problem. Piracy was, by its nature, a crime committed at sea with no witnesses, except the pirates themselves, and if they had survived their victims. To secure convictions, the courts needed testimony, and to get testimony, they offered a bargain. Turn King's evidence. Stand in the box. Point out the men you sailed with, name what they did, and swear an oath as to when they did it. In exchange, walk free, no hanging, no gibbet, no tarred body swinging on the tide at Wapping or Gallows Point, a full royal pardon, and the whole rest of your life to spend as you liked. On paper, this was mercy. It was, in practice, the most corrosive punishment any pirate could receive. Because the pirate world was small, the ports were fewer than the ports of respectable trade, and the men who sailed the Atlantic tavern circuit knew each other by reputation the way village neighbors knew each other by name. In 1718, when the Bahamas pirate hunter Woodus Rogers began accepting surrenders under the King's pardon at New Providence, dozens of men took the offer. But they also learned quickly which of their old shipmates had testified against them and which had not. In November of 1718, at Charleston, when Stede Bonnet and his crew of 33 stood trial for piracy, one of the boatswains, Ignatius Pell, turned King's evidence and testified against the men he had drunk with, fought with, and eaten with for the entire preceding cruise. 29 of those men were hanged. Pell walked away with his life and his freedom, and he vanished into the population of the Carolinas so completely that historians have not found reliable trace of him afterwards. That vanishing is not accidental. To be known as the man who had done it was to make yourself in every port between Boston and Barbados unemployable, unwelcome, and in constant danger of a knife in an alley from any former pirate or friend of a former pirate who recognized your face. Some of the men who turned King's evidence changed their names and moved inland. Some ended up as small farmers in colonies where nobody could pronounce the accent of their childhood. Some are believed to have simply drunk themselves to death in the years afterwards. It is worth being specific about the arithmetic. To turn King's evidence, you had to stand in open court and speak under oath as your captain and your quartermaster and your gunner were led one by one into the dock. Then you had to walk out of the courtroom, past their families, if their families had come, and start over. You had escaped the physical fact of hanging by accepting the social fact of it. In the account books of the Admiralty trials of the 1720s, the number of men who took the bargain is not small. But the number of men in those same account books who lived long, easy lives afterwards, whose names appear again in the record of any respectable trade or town office, is close to zero. That is what turning King's evidence really was. It was not a pardon. It was a sentence that let you keep your heartbeat and took everything else. Number 8. Transportation. In 1717, the Parliament of Great Britain passed a bill called An Act for the Further Preventing Robbery, Burglary, and Other Felonies. It is now remembered as the Transportation Act, and what it did was solve two of the government's problems at the same time. It emptied the overflowing prisons of London and Bristol, and it fed labor into the tobacco fields of the American colonies. The mechanism was simple. A convict who might otherwise have hanged had his sentence commuted to transportation. He was loaded onto a ship carried across the Atlantic in conditions that killed roughly 1 in 7 before landing, and then sold at auction on arrival for a term of years of labor. 7 years for minor offenses. 14 years for capital ones, which included piracy. When the golden age of piracy collapsed under Royal Navy pressure in the 1720s, a substantial number of the men who had sailed under the black flag did not hang. They were transported instead. And every one of those men, standing in the auction pen, on the wharf at Norfolk or Annapolis, understood quickly what had happened to him. He had been sold. Not into an abstract legal category. Sold to a specific man, whose face he could see, who paid a specific sum for his years, and who now owned the disposal of his working hours in every kind of weather until his indenture expired. In the tobacco country of the Chesapeake and the Sugar Islands of the Caribbean, transported pirates found themselves swinging a hoe in fields under a sun that had, in a previous life, been their freedom. Some had spent 3 or 4 years cruising off Madagascar, sleeping on their own hammocks, eating pork and drinking rum from a shared cask, voting on where the ship should sail. Now they slept in a shed with 20 other men, they ate cornmeal boiled in water, and they did what they were told. The mortality on the plantations, especially in the West Indies, was appalling. A convict laborer working the sugar of Jamaica or Barbados in the 1720s could expect on the actuarial numbers to survive between 3 and 5 years if he was strong at the time of sale. Malaria, dysentery, heat exhaustion, injury from cane knives, and the routine casual violence of overseers accounted for the difference. Contemporary accounts contain a phrase that recurs in letters and in prison records from transported men writing back to England. They would rather have hanged. They said it in different words. Some wrote of the shame of being auctioned. Some wrote of the physical work that broke bodies which had learned to expect the different rhythms of shipboard life. Some wrote of the specific horror of the tropical diseases they had not been prepared for. But the sentiment was consistent. A hanging at execution dock was over in 15 minutes. Transportation was over in 7 years. Or 14. Or when your body gave up, whichever came first. And unlike the pirate ship you had once known, there was no vote at the end of the week about what course to steer. You had been reclassified as a piece of property with a term of years attached. In the pirate memoirs and confessions collected by clergymen at Newgate in the years after 1720, the men who had watched their shipmates go to the drop and gone themselves to the auction block wrote a strange sentence more than once. It appears in variations, and it appears in the mouths of otherwise very different men. It says, in effect, that the rope had been the easier road, and they had been given the harder one, and God had not been merciful in the mercy he had shown them. Number 7. The Almadén Mercury Mines. The Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries ran on silver, and silver ran on mercury. So to separate silver from its ore, the refiners of Potosi and Zacatecas used a process called the patio method. And the patio method required mercury in staggering quantities. The empire's chief source of that mercury was a town in central Spain, 300 kilometers south of Madrid, called Almadén. Beginning in 1566, when private contractors could no longer find enough willing laborers to meet the crown's production quotas, Almadén was fed with prisoners. The condemned men sent to Almadén were called forzados, and they were selected out of the same pool that supplied the royal galleys. The pool included convicted pirates and corsairs. It included smugglers, mutineers, deserters, and, later, men convicted of piracy under Spanish jurisdiction in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean. Whether a forzado went to the galleys or to the mines depended on whim, on paperwork, and on need. But it was widely understood, and it appears in the surviving letters of the prisoners themselves, that the men sent to Almadén were being killed by a slower method than the men sent to the ore. The killing agent was mercury vapor, elemental mercury, heated in the furnaces of the mine, and inhaled in the low, poorly ventilated shafts where the ore was dug, enters the human nervous system and does not leave. It attacks the brain, the kidneys, the mouth, and the peripheral nerves. The symptoms progress along a predictable curve. First comes the tremor. The hands shake. The handwriting of a mercury-poisoned man becomes unreadable within his first year. Then come the teeth. The gums swell and blacken. Teeth loosen and fall from the jaw, one after another, sometimes with the crown intact and sometimes crumbling. Then comes the confusion. The prisoner begins to speak nonsense. He forgets his own name. He wakes up unsure of where he is. In the final stage, in a phenomenon that later industrial physicians would call erethism, the sufferer develops extreme irritability, paranoia, and hallucinations. His personality is destroyed. He becomes, as one 17th century Spanish physician wrote of the Almadén men, a shell that speaks. The mortality figures for Almadén in the 16th and 17th centuries are known from the prison records, between 1566 and 1593. Roughly a quarter of the forzados sent to the mine died before their sentences expired, and most of those who survived came out with tremors, missing teeth, and shortened lives. In some particularly hard years, the mortality was much higher. The Fugers, the German banking family who had held the mine lease under contract to the Spanish crown, had themselves begged the king to send more prisoners because so many were dying on the job. This was not a punishment that killed a man in the way ganching killed a man in a single visible morning on a hook set into a wall. This was a punishment that killed a man over years in silence, one nerve fiber at a time, and it had a particular kind of horror attached to it because a prisoner sent to Almadén did not always understand at first what had been done to him. He might work for a year and feel only tired. He might notice in the second year that his hands would not hold a spoon quite steady, and he might blame the cold. It was only in the third year, when the tremor became a shake and the teeth began to go and the strange fits of temper started, that he would recognize what the sentence had actually been. Convicted pirates who ended up in Almadén, and there were a handful across the period, wrote in the marginal record that they wished they had been hanged at Cadiz instead of sent north to the mine. In a sense, Almadén was the mirror image of the ganches of Algiers. The ganches killed you fast and made a public spectacle of the hours. Almadén killed you slowly and made no spectacle at all. But in both cases, the state was doing something more calculated than execution. It was using your body as a demonstration, or as a resource, or as both. Number 6. The French royal galleys. For roughly a century and a half, between the reign of Louis XIV and the abolition of the Cour des Galères in 1748, France maintained a fleet of oared war galleys in the Mediterranean whose rowing benches were filled almost entirely by condemned men. The base was Marseille. The number of rowers on the books at any given time in the peak years ran to several thousand, and a significant portion of them were captured Barbary Corsairs, French subjects convicted of piracy or serving as pirates aboard foreign vessels. Protestant Huguenots sentenced for their faith after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Deserters from the French army, smugglers, and habitual criminals. In the surviving French sentence registers between 1680 and 1748, Some 60,000 men passed through the galley system. The conditions on the benches were, by any honest measurement, worse than the conditions in any prison France had ever built on land. A regular royal galley in the Mediterranean carried about 260 rowers. They Saturday, 5, to a bench chained by the ankle to the bench itself. The bench measured roughly 2 1/3 meters long by 1 1/4 meters wide. Each man had, for his personal space, an area about half a meter wide. That space was where he rowed, where he slept, where he ate, where he relieved himself, where, if he was wounded or sick, he lay until the surgeon came, or more often, until the corpse could be unchained and thrown into the harbor and the bench refilled from the pool of new prisoners waiting at Marseille. The rowing itself is difficult to describe to anyone who has not tried it. A galley oar of the late 17th century was about 12 meters long and weighed enough that 5 men were required to pull it in unison. The stroke rate in combat could reach 25 strokes per minute, and it was maintained under the whip of an overseer called a commite, who walked the central gangway between the benches with a knotted cord and used it whenever the rhythm slipped. In fair weather, with a following wind, the sails were set and the oars were rested. In headwinds, in combat, or in maneuvering to close on a target, the men rowed until they collapsed. Contemporary observers wrote that a fresh crew of French galley rowers could keep station at maximum stroke for perhaps 20 minutes before physical failure began to affect the line. Beyond that, men began to faint at the oar. The commites poured vinegar into their mouths to keep them conscious. If a rower died mid-stroke, he was, in some accounts, simply left in place until the pull was finished, because unchaining him would disrupt the rhythm. The mortality was extraordinary. Roughly 40% of men sentenced to the galleys died during their servitude, and the great majority of those died within the first 3 years. Cold killed as many as combat. In the winter of 1709 and 1710, in the Great European Frost, a third of the Marseille rowers died from famine and exposure, while the galleys sat moored in harbor. And the sentence, for many of them, was for life. When Louis XIV's forbidden Protestants were sent to the benches after 1685, most received sentences of perpetual servitude. They rowed until they died, and there was no legal mechanism by which they could ever come off the oar. Captured Corsairs of the Barbary Coast, taken in French naval operations, were often given the same. In the memoirs of the Huguenot galley slave Jean Martel, who served from 1700 until his release in 1713, there's a passage in which he describes the mental state of new arrivals at Marseille. Martel writes, in effect, that many of them, upon seeing the galley for the first time and understanding what their next years or decades were to be, wept openly and asked the officers to send them back to be hanged instead. It was not a rhetorical request. In the towns from which those men had been marched south to Marseille, some had watched other convicts hanged before their transfer, and they had made a calculation. The rope took 15 minutes. The bench took the rest of a life chained to the same 4 other men who had been chained beside them in the year they arrived, and who would still be chained beside them, if any of them lived that long, in the year they died. Number 5, Roche Brasiliano's wooden spits. There are pirates in the historical record who committed appalling acts because they had convinced themselves those acts served a purpose. And there are pirates who committed appalling acts because a particular kind of appetite had opened inside them and could not be closed. Roche Brasiliano belonged, by every surviving account, to the second category. He was Dutch, born around 1630 in the province of Groningen, and he had grown up in the Dutch colony in Brazil, which is where he got the name that came down to us, Rock the Brazilian. His real name, historians have argued, was likely Gerrit Gerrits Zoon. When the Portuguese reconquered Dutch Brazil in the 1650s, he ended up in Jamaica, and by 1654 he was buccaneering out of Port Royal. His piratical career lasted until the early 1670s and produced substantial prizes, but it is not the prizes that put him in this list. It is what he did with the men who came into his possession afterward. Alexander Exquemelin, the French buccaneer surgeon whose 1678 book The Buccaneers of America is our principal witness to this period, sailed in the Caribbean during Brasiliano's active years and wrote of him in terms that Exquemelin did not use for anyone else. Brasiliano, sober, was already a difficult man to be near. Drunk, he became something else. He would walk the streets of Port Royal with a drawn cutlass and, in Exquemelin's phrase, cut off the arm or leg of the first person he encountered without warning or reason. Nobody intervened, because to intervene against him was to become the next person he encountered. It was against Spanish prisoners, however, that Brasiliano's specific cruelty found its favorite expression. Exquemelin records that in at least several documented cases, Brasiliano tied Spaniards to wooden stakes, spitted them like hogs at a country fair, and roasted them alive between two slow fires. The reason he gave, when he gave a reason, was that the Spaniards had refused to reveal where they had penned their pigs. It is worth pausing on the arithmetic of that. A pen of pigs in the Spanish Main of the 1660s was worth perhaps a few hundred pesos. The men Brasiliano roasted for refusing to give up the pens were dying in his ledger over an animal whose flesh he was in the process of imitating with theirs. That is the mind we are dealing with. He is described in the sources as sober when he did this. Drunk he was, by all accounts, considerably worse. What made Brasiliano feared, in a period that had no shortage of feared men, was the ordinariness with which he moved from the murder of a man to the next transaction of his day. He was not a theatrical villain. He did not make speeches. He simply did what he did, wiped the blade, and went back to his ship. In the accounts, the Spaniards who fell into his hands began after a few years to negotiate the ransoms of their own capture in advance if they suspected his flag was in the vicinity, because the alternative was worse than any monetary loss they could imagine. Brasiliano vanished from the historical record around 1671. What happened to him is not clear. In some versions, he was lost at sea. In others, he simply disappeared. Nobody in the surviving Port Royal correspondence seems to have missed him. Even in a town that had made its wealth on the buccaneers and had celebrated men whose hands were also unclean, the closing of Roche Brasiliano's account was recorded in the local memory as a relief. Number 4. Slow matches between the fingers. In the buccaneer sack of Panama, in 1671, Henry Morgan's men entered a city they had crossed the isthmus on foot to reach, and once inside, they discovered a problem. The wealth of Panama had, in the days before their arrival, been loaded onto ships and evacuated. The famous silver of the mule trains, the plate of the churches, the coined pesos of the merchants, most of it was gone. What remained, in Morgan's calculation, was the people. The people, presumably, knew where the wealth had been hidden or shipped. So Morgan's buccaneers, over the 3 weeks they held Panama, applied to the surviving population of the city what Exquemelin describes dryly as ordinary methods of interrogation. Among those methods was the slow match between the fingers. A slow match in the period was a length of chemically treated hemp or cotton cord used to fire matchlock muskets and touch-off cannon. It burned at a steady, slow, glowing rate approximately a foot every 3 hours in still air. It was, in effect, a portable, adjustable, disciplined source of heat. And the buccaneers of the Caribbean discovered that a length of slow match tied tightly between the fingers of a prisoner at the base joint and then lit at both ends produced a sensation that men would talk to escape. The match burned through the flesh of the finger slowly. It did not sever the finger. It did not cause massive blood loss. It was almost never immediately fatal. It simply worked its way through the meat of the hand one joint at a time, generating a pain that the interrogator could regulate by the rate at which he permitted the cord to advance. When the prisoner talked, the cord could be pulled out. If he did not talk, the cord kept burning. In the accounts of the Panama sack and of the earlier raid at Maracaibo in 1669, Exquemelin gives us specific images. A merchant with his hands bound behind his back and the slow match tied between his fingers. The buccaneers standing around him, not with any particular urgency, but with the patience of men waiting for a kettle to boil. Some prisoners died under the treatment, but that was almost always an accident. The point was not to kill them. The point was to have information, and a dead man is a bad source. Slow matches were the everyday tool. The technique required no equipment the buccaneers did not already carry in their powder horns. It required no exotic setting. It could be performed in a farmyard, in a church in the parlor of a captured house, in the hold of a ship. And it was portable to almost any environment where a buccaneer had a prisoner and a question. This is what makes it different in the psychology of the survivors from the more theatrical tortures. A Spanish captive who was strapped down and racked, or who was set upon by a man like Brasiliano, at least understood that he had entered an exceptional moment. The slow match between the fingers was not exceptional. It was routine. It was what happened after dinner. In the surviving Spanish colonial correspondence from Panama in the years after Morgan's raid, the phrase that recurs in letter after letter to the crown in Madrid is not the phrase you might expect. It is not a phrase about massacre or about destruction of property. It is a phrase about the ordinary character of the cruelty. Governor after governor writes that the buccaneers did not seem to consider what they were doing to be extraordinary at all. They did it, and they discussed the weather while they did it. That is what a slow match between the fingers really produced. Not just the pain of the burning cord. The permanent understanding, in the men who survived it, that they had been questioned by people for whom their agony had been an item of paperwork. Number 3. Edward Lowe's lip broiling. On the 25th of January, 1723, in the Eastern Atlantic, the pirate Captain Edward Lowe, sometimes called Ned Lowe, took a Portuguese merchant vessel called the Nostra Senhora de Vitória. She was bound home from Brazil, and she was carrying, according to the eyewitness testimony that later reached Governor John Hart, in Antigua, and was forwarded to London in an official report dated the 25th of March, 1724, a bag of gold moidores worth approximately 11,000 pieces of that coinage. It was a substantial fortune. The Portuguese captain, whose name has not come down to us, had hung the bag out of the stern cabin window on a length of rope, and as soon as Lowe's boarders were on his deck, he cut the rope and let the bag drop into the Atlantic. The gold went to the bottom. It was, by every rational calculation, the correct decision from the Portuguese captain's point of view. If Lowe had taken the coins, he would have used them to outfit further piracy, and the captain would have been killed anyway, on the general principle by which Lowe did not leave witnesses. Dropping the bag over the side deprived Lowe of the prize, and, by the captain's calculation, was likely the only meaningful act of resistance he could still perform. What Lowe did in response is one of the incidents that, in the historical assessment of the golden age of piracy, has kept his reputation at the extreme end of the register, even in a period with no shortage of dark reputations. In Governor Hart's report to London, based on the sworn statements of survivors, Lowe ordered the Portuguese captain's lips cut off. He then had them broiled in front of the captain and forced him to eat them while they were still hot. Only after this had been done did Lowe order the murder of the entire remaining crew of the Vitória, 32 men in total. Then he set the ship on fire and sailed away. To understand what happened on that afternoon, it is necessary to understand something about Edward Lowe as a captain. Lowe had been born in London around 1690, had passed through various petty crimes in England before emigrating, and had become a pirate in the summer of 1722 in the Bay of Honduras, after an argument with a merchant captain over the timing of his lunch, during which he had picked up a loaded musket, fired at the captain, missed, and killed another man. His piratical career from that moment lasted 2.5 years, during which he took at least 100 ships, and in a substantial number of those captures, he applied to the prisoners a level of specific and creative cruelty that appears, in the sources, to have been personal. He cut off ears, he slit noses, he tied burning matches between fingers in the manner already described. He had prisoners rope flogged with the ends of loaded pistols. In one incident in New England, he had a captain sit at a table with his own severed ears in front of him on a plate. But the lip broiling is the incident that survivors and later writers returned to because it contained a particular arithmetic. The Portuguese captain had cost the pirates a specific sum. Lowe's response was to make the man eat, physically the part of his own body that had spoken the order to cut the rope. It was punishment as literalized metaphor. The mouth that had given the command was consumed by the man to whom the mouth belonged. This is not the reasoning of an ordinary criminal. This is the reasoning of a mind that has convinced itself that punishment must be signposted. That it must, in some absurd sense, teach a lesson. In the trial records of Lowe's later captured associates, several of them testified that even they, hardened by 2 or 3 years under the black flag, had become afraid of him toward the end. His own quartermaster is said to have refused to sail with him after one particular episode of shipboard cruelty. In 1724, one of his own crew appears to have mutinied against him, put him in a longboat, and set him adrift with no supplies. What became of him after that is disputed. Some accounts say he was picked up by a French vessel, tried and hanged at Martinique. Others say he simply died at sea. Nobody in the pirate community that survived him seems to have gone looking. The Portuguese captain of the Nostra Senhora de Vitória has no known grave. He is remembered only through the report of the governor of Antigua, who received his story from the men who watched him die. And what he is remembered for is the moment when he decided, in the space of the few seconds available to him, that letting a fortune go to the bottom of the Atlantic was worth doing, even though he must have suspected from the character of the man he was dealing with what the response was likely to be. In that decision, and in the response it produced, we have the whole arithmetic of Edward Lowe's cruelty on one page. Number 2, Woolding the knotted cord around the head. Of all the tortures the 17th century buccaneers of the Spanish Main devised for their Spanish prisoners, the one that appears most often in the surviving sources, and the one that seems to have terrified subsequent generations of victims most consistently, was called Woolding. It is described in detail in Alexander Exquemelin's Buccaneers of America, published in Dutch in Amsterdam in 1678, and its horror lies in its almost mechanical simplicity. A length of cord, sometimes hemp, sometimes rawhide, sometimes a wetted length of the buccaneer's own rope, was tied around the prisoner's forehead. Knots were placed at intervals along the cord so that the pressure would be uneven and would concentrate on specific points of the skull. A stick, or in some accounts an iron rod, was inserted through the cord at the back of the head and used as a lever. The lever was turned, the cord shortened, the knots dug in, and with each turn of the stick, the pressure on the skull increased. What Woolding did to the human head if the turning continued past a certain point was very specific. The eyes, forced by the internal pressure of the compressed skull, began to bulge from their sockets. The eyeballs would swell until, in Exquemelin's phrase, repeated across multiple accounts, they appeared to be the size of eggs. If the turning went further, the eyes could be forced out of the head entirely. This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the physical mechanism of what the torture was designed to do. The buccaneers of the mid-17th century used Woolding as their standard interrogation technique when they wanted a Spanish prisoner to reveal where valuables had been hidden. It was particularly favored by François Lolognese, the buccaneer of Tortuga, whose nickname among the Spanish was Fléau des Espagnols, the flail of the Spaniards. Exquemelin, who had personal knowledge of Lolognese's methods, describes him applying Woolding to Spanish soldiers taken in the raids of the 1660s. In one account, Lolognese took a Spanish prisoner, applied the strappado until both of the man's shoulders were dislocated, then applied Woolding until the eyes bulged. Then, still not receiving the confession he wanted, resorted to further and worse mutilations. But it is the Woolding specifically that recurs in the survivor testimony because of a particular characteristic it possessed. Unlike other tortures, which caused pain by damage to the body's peripheral tissues, Woolding attacked the head itself, the seat of consciousness, and it did so in a way that the prisoner could feel from the inside. He could feel his own eyes being pushed out of his own face. He could feel the interior of his own skull being compressed against itself. It was, in the specific sense, an assault on the container of the self. Henry Morgan's buccaneers in the sack of Panama in 1671 employed Woolding routinely against the surviving population of the city. Exquemelin gives us the account of one particular man in Panama who, having no more information to give and having endured Woolding to the point that his eyes were, as the phrase went, standing out big as eggs, was then hung by the wrists, beaten with sticks, had his nose and ears cut off, had his face burned with straw, and was finally run through by a slave the buccaneers had brought with them for that purpose. The whole procedure took several hours. It was, Exquemelin adds, the common sport and recreation of the pirates. And that phrase, sport and recreation, is what makes Woolding rank so high on this list. In the buccaneer camps of the Caribbean, when a Spanish prisoner was brought aboard, and there was suspicion he might know the location of concealed wealth, the Woolding was not treated as an emergency measure or a last resort. It was treated as an ordinary tool. The cord and the stick were kept ready. The men who administered it were practiced. The victims, if they survived, and many did not, carried the marks of the cord on their foreheads for the rest of their lives. There is a passage in Exquemelin describing the return of Morgan's expedition to Port Royal in 1671, in which he notes that the surviving Spanish captives brought back to Jamaica were recognizable at first glance from the scars on their heads. That is the physical residue of Woolding, the mental residue. We can only guess at from the fact that when the buccaneers of the Caribbean lost their grip on the region and the era of the Golden Age pirates began in the 1690s, one of the specific torture techniques the new generation of pirates chose to inherit from their buccaneer predecessors was the knotted cord around the head. It had proved its usefulness. The men who had once been on the receiving end and had watched their friends' eyes bulge from their sockets remembered, and when their sons went to sea, they told them. That is how a technique like Woolding survives across generations. It survives because it is remembered by the people it was used on. Number 1, sweating. And so we arrive at number 1, and it is worth being explicit about why this punishment sits at the top of the list, even though on the surface it would seem to be less physically extreme than some of what has come before. What makes sweating the most terrible pirate punishment on record is not the sum of injury it inflicted. It is what it revealed about the mind of the men inflicting it. And it is what it did over the course of the running to the man on whom it was inflicted. Sweating, as it was practiced during the golden age of piracy, and as it is documented in the surviving trial records and eyewitness accounts of the 1710s and 1720s, worked as follows. A prisoner, sometimes a captured merchant captain, and sometimes a member of the pirate crew being punished, was placed inside a ring formed by the assembled pirates. The ring encircled the base of the mizzenmast, or in some ships, the mainmast, on the open deck. Each man in the ring was armed. Some carried sail needles, the heavy iron needles used for stitching canvas, sharpened at the point. Some carried forks. Some carried the small knives called knife and file that pirates typically wore at the belt. Some carried the tips of their cutlasses held down at hip height. The prisoner was told to run. He was to run in a circle around the mast, inside the ring of pirates, and he was to keep running. Around him, standing in position, the men of the ring would jab, sail needles at the ribs, forks at the buttocks, cutlass tips at the shoulders. Each pass around the mast delivered new punctures in new places from new hands. And the whole thing was accompanied in the classic form of the ritual by the ship's musicians. Pirate ships kept fiddlers and pipers, and sometimes small ensembles of captured African drummers, and during a sweating the band played. They played jigs, they played hornpipes, they played the same dance tunes the pirates played on the deck at the end of a successful cruise when the rum was being broken out. And the prisoner ran. He ran until he could no longer run. Sometimes this was 10 minutes, sometimes it was 30. In one account of a sweating conducted aboard a ship of the pirate Charles Vane, whose reputation for casual cruelty was such that even his own crew eventually mutinied against him and put Calico Jack Rackham in his place. A merchant captain was made to run around the mast for the better part of an hour. When he fell, they poked him with the needles until he stood up and ran again. When he fell the second time and could not be made to rise, they left him on the deck and went back to their rum. He is described in the eyewitness account given at the Vane trial as having been so pierced by the needles and forks and blades of his tormentors that his skin resembled a colander. He was still alive, but his mind had gone. What makes sweating the number 1 punishment on this list is not the physical injury. Most sweating survivors, in the surviving records, did not die from the immediate wounds. Infection often killed them later. Some carried the scars, but recovered. What makes sweating so terrible is the specific fact that it was recreation. It was, in the mind of the pirates who administered it, entertainment. The band played, the men laughed, rum was drunk, bets were placed on how long the runner would last. The whole ritual had the structure of a country dance or a village festival, and the man at the center, bleeding and running, was the entertainment. That is the thing that makes sweating uniquely terrible. Ganching, on the walls of Algiers, was arithmetic. It was designed to teach a lesson to the other slaves. Woolding, in the hands of the buccaneers, was interrogation. It was designed to produce information. The slow match between the fingers was routine police work by a very violent police force. The French galleys were a state-organized labor system. The Mercury mines of Almadén were a slower version of the same thing. Even Edward Lowe's lip broiling, awful as it was in his mind a lesson being taught. Sweating was none of these things. Sweating was fun. The men who invented it, and who repeated it in the taverns of Nassau and on the decks of ships off the Carolina coast in the years between 1715 and 1725, invented it because they enjoyed it. They enjoyed watching a man run in circles until he collapsed. They enjoyed the specific choreography of the ring, the mast, the fiddler, and the needles. They enjoyed the way the prisoner's expression changed as he understood in the first few passes that this was going to go on longer than he had thought. Most of the cruelties in the historical record of piracy can be traced, if you look hard enough, to some rational purpose. Money, information, deterrence, revenge. Sweating cannot be traced to any of these things. It served no purpose. It produced no information. It did not scare other captains into cooperating faster because those other captains often did not survive to tell the story. It did not deter mutiny among the crew because the crew were the ones doing it. It existed simply because a group of men had found something they thought was funny, and they had built a whole ritual around it, and they performed it in the surviving trial records on ship after ship after ship for the better part of a decade. That is why sweating is number one. Because when you have counted through the hooks of the Barbary walls and the courtrooms of Charleston and the tobacco fields of Virginia and the Mercury mines of Almadén and the galleys of Marseille and the wooden spits of Roche Brasiliano and the burning cords in the fingers of Panama merchants and the broiled lips of a Portuguese captain and the bulging eyes of Spanish soldiers under a knotted rope, you are left with one final image, and it is the image of a man running in circles around a wooden mast on a summer afternoon in the Caribbean while pirates jab him with sewing needles and a fiddler plays a hornpipe. Everything else on this list was cruelty in the service of something. Sweating was cruelty in the service of nothing but itself. And that, in the final calculation, is what makes it the most feared pirate punishment of all. That is 10 punishments the pirates and their prisoners feared more than the rope itself, and every one of them is preserved in the trial records, the memoirs, the governor's reports, and the survivor testimony that has come down to us from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The rope at Execution Dock, or at Gallows Point, or at Charleston Battery was over in a quarter of an hour. Everything you have heard tonight lasted longer. Some lasted days, some lasted years. Some lasted for the rest of a shortened life in the shape of a scar across the forehead, or a tremor in the hand, or a name that could never again be spoken in a Boston tavern without a man reaching for his knife. If this journey through the dark arithmetic of the pirate world has held you all the way to the end, I want to ask you 3 things before you go. First, tap that like button, because the algorithm treats a like as a signal to show this kind of long-form pirate history to more people who love it as much as you do. Second, subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell for notifications because there is more of this material coming, and I do not want you to miss the next one. And third, tell me in the comments which of tonight's 10 punishments would have terrified you the most. Was it the hooks on the wall of Algiers? Was it the slow burn of a match between your fingers in a Panama farmhouse? Was it the ring of fiddlers and pirates around the mizzenmast on a sunny afternoon in the Caribbean? Or was it the quieter horror of a mercury mine in central Spain, killing you one nerve at a time over 3 years? Tell me down below, and tell me what country you are watching from because this channel spans the whole world and I read every comment that comes in. Thank you, as always, for watching. The men on both sides of these punishments, the ones who inflicted them and the ones who endured them, are all long dead. What they left behind is the record. And every time we tell these stories again, we keep the record alive. I will see you in the next one.